To start.
Okay. Welcome everyone who is actually joining Swakan today with us. Swakan is annual conference on human flourishing, and today we having one of the very special guests with us. I personally call him as a modern builder of the Indian liberal movement in India. He was actually built a platform that many of the young liberal can actually utilize that infrastructure and build something out of it to promote the ideas of freedom and free markets and limited government. Our organization is one of the institute that are actually benefiting through his decades of work. And I will go to his formal bio. Parth Shah is actually founder president of the Center for Civil Society. CCS advances social change through public policy, and their work is known in education, livelihood, and governance. And they also run a lot of public policy educational opportunities for young people who's actually interested in public policy and building a career in development sector. And Parth was actually previously was a professor at University of Michigan before he actually come back to India, start Center for Civil Society. And he strongly believe in markets actually a only solution that can actually help large amount of the poor people who's actually in leftover in the lower level of the Indian population, and he utilized tools of the market and freedom and to actually empower the people who's in actually in the marginalized communities and actually able to build a better life for them. Without any further delay, I would like to welcome Parth Shah from Center for Civil Society to talk about history of liberalism and why it is actually relevant for India. Welcome, Parth Shah, and floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving this platform. I'm very excited to see how the new organization that all of you have started has sort of coming along so well. And I'm very pleased and actually proud that you've been able to bring a lot of people from around the world, right, to engage with the audience in India. And I think that is probably one of the benefits of the current situation, where we could engage on Zoom with people who are anywhere in the world. Right? Just 1 second. So what I think the topic is liberalism in India. What I thought I would do is to just quickly give you a sense of the liberal tradition in India. Quite often when you talk about liberal ideas, particularly of individual rights and market economy, many people's initial reaction, and that is true in my own experience for the last 20 years in India, is that these are the Western ideas, right? They are not really Indian ideas. And so why are we talking about those ideas in our country as a solution to our problems? Right? So what I want to do is just give you sort of a brief overview of the individuals who have been important sort of part of the liberal tradition, something about the organizations which have been also have built this long history in India, and I think some of the publications. And I was quite surprised to see in the in Pune Gokhale Institute Library some of the magazines that they had from 1920s and 1930s, right? Which of course have continued even after that. So I think just giving you a quick overview of what has happened in India and why these ideas are as much a part of us as people, as intellectual, or as thought schools of thought within the country. Right? And once given that, the second thing I want to do is to give you sort of sense of the current challenge, not just because of the pandemic, but also because of the rise of they call alpha males who are in power in many of the countries around the world, right? And how the authoritarian appeal has becoming stronger and stronger. People's faith in democracy is reducing, right? and at the same time, people's faith in markets is also going down. And so, how do liberals can possibly understand what is going on, and what could be a possible response to it? This is one of the ideas I've been sort of thinking about for some time, and I would love to have a sort of longer chat and Q&A. Hopefully, we can you can challenge some of those things and see whether it makes sense in the Indian context or not. Right. So I'll share my screen. I'll have a quick sort of PPT that will bring out the individuals, organizations, and publications, which I think give us a very good understanding of the long tradition of liberal ideas and philosophy that we have in India. Right. So I'm starting with the individuals. I think first individual that I would always think of when I think of market liberal ideas in India is Professor Br Shawano. Right. He's of course most famous for his note of dissent on the second 5-year plan. Right. So he was part of the committee that was drafting second 5-year plan, but he wrote a very strong note of dissent and has become, in a sense, a torchbearer of sorts for people who believe in market liberal ideas in India. Right. And many of the things, of course, he predicted in the note. Why second 5-year plan as a plan, as well as in terms of the specifics of the plan, is not going to deliver what government is promising people that it will deliver. Right. He taught at Ahmedabad in Gujarat University for a long time. He actually was, as I say, representative of the IMF and also worked in Sri Lanka for some time, advising the Sri Lanka in terms of the reforms that they can undertake. Right. The CCS has published the 2 collection of his sort of writings. One which is sort of more theoretical, which is more about, you can say, academic, economic writings that he has done. And the second is more about his sort of more day-to-day engagement with the issues of the time and the writing that he had on that. So one volume is called The Theoretical Vision for Br Shawano, and the second is Economic Prophecies. It's a great sort of way of get to know his thinking. And I'm sure you won't be surprised that many of his ideas are even radical today. Right. The second person, I think, and some of you probably know him because he was a very important political actor in the post-independence India, Minu Masani, one of the first president of the Swatantrata Party, right, and has continued to build on that for a long time. Right? So I'm going through a little quickly because there's no point for me to give you details too much of this. You will find all of these individuals, a lot of their writings online. If I can plug one website that CCS has created called indianliberals.in, where we have been able to, is an archive in a sense of the liberal writings in India. Right? Much of that is in English language, but we have material also in Marathi, quite a good material in Hindi and also in Gujarati. And there are, I think, other languages that we are compiling, Bengali particularly so. Right? So that's a good website for you to sort of not only get to know the individuals I'm talking about here, but also to see their writing firsthand. Right? And much of that is easily accessible there, and also searchable site. So Minu Masani, very important figure in the sort of political battle of liberal ideas in India. Swatantrata Party, as you know, one of the, not one, but one of the only truly liberal political party that we ever had, at least for the longest period of time in Indian history. Right? We have had some recent ones, but not for as long as Swatantrata has been there. And certainly not as successful as Swatantrata was. Nani Palkhiwala, many of you probably heard of him, the very famous lawyer. He's known for some of the key Supreme Court cases, important one about the structure of the Constitution and why the original structure should not be violated by changes even to the Constitution and certainly by changes in the law. Right? Very important figure for liberal thought in India. Even though he was a lawyer, a lot of his sort of fame comes from the fact that he used to deliver sort of a comment or a commentary speech on the budget, right? So every year when the budget sort of came out, next day he would have his own presentation on the budget. And I think after a few years, it became so popular that it was being held at the cricket stadium in Mumbai. It's sort of hard to imagine today that you can fill up a cricket stadium for a topic of a sort of commentary on Indian budget, right? But that's what he was able to do successfully year after year. And I think many of his ways of analyzing budget are also very relevant even today when you think about what is being presented by our governments. Right? Rajgopalachari, obviously, also far more important player in the overall Indian freedom struggle, but also I think one of the biggest and I think one of the most critical challenge of sort of Nehru's sort of monopoly on Indian thought, if you want to put it that way, right? Or India's sort of future path, right? That Nehru had envisioned. You know, Rajgopalachari was, I think, key figure in that at the time, who had even though, of course, very supportive of Nehru, and of course they were great friends together, but was able to chart a very different intellectual path for India, right? And once he realized that that is not going to be possible by being in the Congress and working within the system, he became, even at a very old age, took the initiative and had the courage to start a new political party, the Swatantrata Party. Right? Of course, there are many things about him in terms of when he was the Governor General of India, but also when he ran the Madras state as a chief minister, and the things he did as a chief minister there still sort of stand out in terms of what a good governance looks like. I'm going to skip some of this part of the ideas. Dr. Ambedkar, obviously, a very important figure. Everybody claims that he belongs to them. And so I'm not going to make a claim that he belongs only to liberals, but I think much of his economic writings for quite some time, in the early part of his career particularly so, have been very market friendly. Right? You should know that he was probably the first Indian Indian who had both a law degree and a PhD in economics. Right? It's a very unusual combination at the time, but somehow he found to make a match between law and economics. Right? Which of course today is a whole field by itself, law and economics. And I think his economic learnings at Columbia, right, where such, and of course his engagement with some of the Indian debates at the time, clearly indicate that the young Dr. Ambedkar was very much in favor of sort of open markets and liberal ideas. It is Shroff, and I'll talk a bit more about that in terms of the Forum of Free Enterprise, one of the forums that kept the flame of liberal ideas in India alive for a long time. Right? He was the founder of the forum, and certainly one of the great champions within the business community. He was a business person himself, and I think he was one of the leading light in that community. Mr. S.V. Raju, who passed away just a few years ago. This is a book that we produced in his sort of memory as a festschrift, Liberalism in India. It's a collection of essays written in his honor, as essays from Gurcharan Das and many, many others who you would associate with liberal thought in India. Right? It's a good collection. I think those of you who want to know some recent sort of thinking and individuals who are working in this space, this would be a good way to acquaint yourself with. Right? Mr. Raju actually was the secretary of Swatantrata Party, worked very closely with Minu Masani. And after his passing, and Swatantrata, of course, not being a very important player in political space, he kept the flag flying for these ideas throughout his life. Right? So he's a sort of one man sort of army who kept fighting for these ideas despite the fact that there was very little support for them. Mr. Sharad Joshi, he actually worked abroad for a while, then came back to India and became a farmer. So near Pune, he got his farm there and worked as a farmer. Through that experience, he learned how unremunerative agriculture was and has been, right? And then created a whole movement of farmers around the idea of free market and free economy, particularly in agriculture. Right? I think one of the biggest champion of freedom for farmers. Satkari Sangathan was his organization, also a sort of political gathering. He was a Rajya Sabha member for some time. Right? I think much of the, maybe if you remember, just in the last month or so, the new reforms have been announced for agriculture. If you read any of the writings of Mr. Joshi, you will find, sorry about the background noise, you will find that many of these ideas have been there for a long, long time, right? And not just ideas, but also in terms of how to execute them. He had put together, and he was part of many of the commissions for agriculture reform. I think one of the youngest sort of member of this liberal community in India is my good old friend, Savik Chakravarti. He won the Bastia Prize for his writings. There are quite a few books that you will find on CCS website. And I think if you just search his name, you will find a lot of his writings. He's a prolific writer, a great speaker, one of the most beloved speaker at all the CCS student seminars. People enjoyed his company, not just his ideas. He's a great person to hang around. Right? And I think a good role model for young people who want to fight these battles of their own. Right? So here are some of the individuals that I sort of talked about. And there are, of course, many more. I'm just being selective in terms of giving you highlight of this. I'm also not talking about people before independence. Of course, there are many reformers and liberal activists we had before independence. I'm just giving you sort of a view of what has happened after independence by and large. Right? So I said I talked about liberal individuals, now some liberal organizations. I think it's important to think about organizations because that is the way we sort of progress, right? You carry the torch forward from generation to generation. So individuals obviously come and go, but organizations hopefully stay longer and provide that support, right, to the ideas to flourish and continue to grow, right? And some of the organizations, some of the recent ones, which are Eddie Stroff Memorial Trust, the Palkhiwala Memorial Trust. There's also MR Pai Foundation. MR Pai was one of the activists, particularly a consumer activist for quite some time and ran the Forum of Free Enterprise. So I think biggest name that you can think of in the post-independence India as an organization that has sort of carried the ideas forward is the Forum of Free Enterprise. Is there even today. If you go to their website, you will find the work that they do. They're, of course, not as prominent, as active as they were in their heydays, but still an important source of these ideas. I already mentioned Swatantrata Party. There's a lot of writings. We actually got the papers of Swatantrata Party from Mr. Raju. So after he passed away, they were donated to CCS. We actually digitized them. And the papers are now housed in the Nehru Memorial Library. So those of you who are interested in looking at the history of Swatantrata Party, and there are many important ideas which are in those papers. And of course, to our current debate about political funding or funding of political parties, you will see how Swatantrata was funded, and how clear Rajaji, Minu Masani and others were in terms of the transparency and accountability that funding must bring to a public organization. And if you read the exchange of letters, some of the minutes of the meeting in which they debated the nature and of funding is very, very relevant to the debate that we have today about political funding, political party funding. As you can see, they were the major opposition party in 1967 election. And after 1971, the Indira wave certainly had a huge impact on the Swatantrata Party. And after that, slowly it sort of petered out, got merged later on with the Janata Party that came to power after emergency in 1979. Right. Quickly on the liberal periodicals, these are some of the magazines, some of which are still there. Freedom First has been the sort of longest running periodical, ran initially by Minu Masani and then for a long, long time by Mr. S.V. Raju, whom I spoke about just earlier. I think they stopped the print edition after Mr. Raju passed away, which is quite unfortunate that we could not find a good editor and financial support to continue the hard copy version of Freedom First. They still publish an online version of it. You just Google it, you will find their website along with the old issues as well as the new issues. Some of the old issues are also on the website I talked about earlier, indianliberals.in. Right? Swaraj magazine, which was sort of Rajaji was the key contributor to it. Kasa Subba Rao and his family has been running it. As you know, there's a newer avatar of that, which has been revived with the same name, but under a new sort of banner. So relaunched in 2014. Yeah. These are some of the other periodicals Forum of Enterprise used to publish. These are the booklets that they had, and in terms of hundreds now that you will find on the website. Right? And a couple of very interesting publications that I did not know, frankly, until in the Gokhale Institute Library. The Free Economic Review is one of the sort of older publications. And as you can see, what it says in the byline, incorporating the libertarian. So that was a publication before the Free Economic Review. And so amazing when I first came across this, to think about when the word libertarian was used, not just used in the political and intellectual discourse in India, but it was, there's a magazine with the same name, which carried those ideas and made a frequent commentary on public affairs, right? So the fact that, that these ideas are so much part of our culture and us, right, is easy to see that even what is considered to be quite an radical point of view even today was very commonly discussed, debated, was part of the mainstream discourse in some sense in the 1920s and 30s and 50s in India. The first one sort of became converted, turned into the Indian Libertarian, which ran in the 70s also. Lotwala was one of the key founders. His daughter Kusum Lotwala was also the one who carried the torch forward. Here are some of the pages from the Indian Libertarian, the Libertarian Social Institute, which was also there, had its own library that you could go and read. So it was very well organized sort of force, right, in the Indian political thought, right, the libertarian ideas, which I think for anyone now would be even hard to imagine that was really possible or could have been there in our history, right? So I think I've given you sort of quick overview of the individuals, organizations, and the periodicals of the liberal tradition in India, right? Quickly, I want to talk briefly about, in my view, of the future of Indian liberalism, right? So I think there are three individuals who have different strands of thinking that if you bring them together, you could create a sort of a new, vibrant sort of discourse on liberal ideas in India, even today, right? So I sort of bucket the overall architecture of sort of philosophy or ideology in three different arenas, right? One, of course, is economics. Second is politics. And the third, you can say cultural, or how does one view the overall sort of society and social engagement, right? And for each of these three buckets, I think there's one individual that exemplifies very clearly what Indian liberal sort of future could look like, or should be what we should be sort of, in a sense, working for to build and develop further. Right. So in terms of politics, I think Gandhiji by far is closest to the liberal tradition. Right. I'm going to show you a couple of quotes by him, and it's sort of, if you have not read them before, you will be shocked to see this is what Gandhi thought of state, not just Indian state, but the state in general, right? This is his sort of championing of individual freedom, why it is at the foundation of any civilized society, and people who deny individual liberty would never be able to have a well-functioning civilized society, right? His quote about government control, right? It reminds you of Friedrich Hayek and more actually even of Milton Friedman, right? Whose famous statement was that if you give Sahara Desert to government, very soon there'll be shortage. And this is something beyond that actually that Gandhi actually talked about in terms of self-help and how the state control undermines the basic dignity of the individual, right? And the third, which I think makes him very clearly an anarchist, right? I think the Gram Swaraj idea that we know as village republic is really sort of glorified in terms of the economics of it, right? The small is beautiful, economic terms. I think what was most important for Gandhi, or equally important to Gandhi, was not just the economics of it, but also the politics of it, right? And he believed that the state is an organized and concentrated sort of force, is a source of violence. And as long as it exists, it would undermine the soul of the human beings, right? I think, so Gandhi's ideas, particularly in terms of politics, I think are the ones we should be exploring further to build a narrative of the sort of future of Indian liberal thought in India. Similarly, I think the ideas of Rajaji in economics, right? So much of his writing in economics particularly is something that we could easily build on. There's a lot of sort of Indian content to it. There's also a lot of role for spirituality and some of the things that we consider to be very integral part of who we are, right? And he has found a way to integrate those parts into his economic system and give, I think, very interesting combination of sort of Indian philosophy and economics combined and woven in a way that makes sense even today. And I think it makes more and more sense for the post-COVID world that we are moving into. And the third person that I put on the screen was Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore. I think his ideas, not so much particularly on economics, but I think even overall in those areas, but particularly that I want to emphasize is this cosmopolitan sort of approach, right? The debate that he had with Gandhi, right? And he wanted sort of wind to blow from all corners of the world. And Gandhi wanted sort of a house to stand with windows open, but of course not everything open to the wind of the world. Right? And a very interesting debate happened between Gandhi and Tagore in terms of the internationalization or the worldview and cosmopolitan nature of the world that Tagore supported. I think if you combine those three set of ideas, the politics of Gandhi, economics of Rajaji, and the cultural and cosmopolitan views of Tagore, we get a, I think, very unique synthesis of Indian liberal tradition, and not just a tradition, but also the future of liberalism in India. Right? Now, having said that, the last point I want to make before I think we open. I said there's something that I'm sort of presenting to you as a sort of one of the ideas I'm playing with, and see what you make of it. So I think the current debate that we have about anti-globalization, right, as well as the sort of rise of populism and sort of populist leaders across the world, right, including in the Western world, right, and much of that is blamed on economics and on globalization. So much of this sort of commentary that you see blames what is happening in India, I mean, not around the world for last sort of 5 to 10 years, right, is sort of broken economics. Right? And what I want to sort of present to you is an argument that is not so much the economics that is broken, but it's really the politics that is broken. And if that is the case, then by fixing economics, which means anti-globalization or becoming Swadeshi, just not India but around the world, right, is not going to be a solution to the current crisis, right? And the solution to the current crisis lies in fixing the politics. Right? One way to think about this is a political economy, which was a term that was used for economics and politics earlier, right, in the classical age. Slowly, we sort of separated them out. For economics became a separate discipline, and of course, very different from politics to a large extent. But as we know, you may be able to teach economics and politics separately in the classroom. But in the real world, they are joined at the hip, right? Because economic policies are made by and through politics in any country, at least any democratic country, right? And so you can't really separate them out just like the way you are able to do in a classroom setting or in an academic setting when you teach these subjects, right? And so both are actually joined at the hip. Now, what that means is that wherever the joining, in a sense, has happened in the right way, or you can say largely liberal approach, you find much more sort of organized outcome, right? And this is, I'm showing you as just an example, not really maybe the best example of economic activity, but this is the sort of the fulfillment center of Amazon, right? Where every small item, right, from a toothbrush to toothpaste, right, is neatly packed, right, numbered, and kept, right? You can access that item at any point in time, right? And this is what the economic organization has delivered, right, in the modern society. Now compare this economic organization that you see and we take it for granted, right, with how our politics works, right? Now I'm just putting one image in front of you, and I think this will give you not just what happens in India. This is not, of course, this Indian parliament that I'm showing you, but you can find the pictures of a very similar kind, or sometimes even more brutal, right? The fist fight and everything else included, right? In many countries. I was surprised to see you can find similar pictures even in the US, right? So in the 18th century, in the US Congress, you will see very similar things that we see today, in a sense, in our Indian parliament. So this is what politics has been, right? Over 200 years or so, or maybe 250 years or 300 years of democracy that we have practiced, right? The politics has not really changed that much. Right? It is same battles, the same way it's being organized and being run, right? And I think that is where I see that our economic system has gone so far, where even simple things are easily accessible for the large masses, right? In politics, that is not the case. We are still voting someone in power, right, for 5 years, and then having to wait around for those 4 or 5 years of the term before you can re-engage with the politics, right? I think it's an important lesson when you compare the economics and politics. You see how far behind the politics is compared to how economics has evolved in the last 200-300 years, right? And why is that the case? I think there are many answers. The one answer that I want to put forward now and sort of argue for is that the architecture, the governance structure of the regulatory system that is around the economy. I'm giving an example of the Companies Act in the case of India, right? the Companies Act that governs the firm that play their role in the economic system, right, is quite different, right, compared to the act within which the politics, sort of political firms, I'm going to put it that way, play their role, right? And there are fundamental differences in terms of how we approach the regulation of companies and how we approach the regulation of the similar entity in politics, which is the political party, right? So the regulation of political parties and the companies are on very diametrically opposite spectrum, right? From everything in terms of accountability, transparency, right? Even a simple thing like truth in advertising. Now, we have that for companies. You cannot lie in your ads, right? We have no such thing in for political parties. Right? So you can see the huge difference, that the chasm between how we govern the foundations of our economy, the firms and companies, and how we govern the foundations of our politics, the political parties. Right? And I think unless we breach that chasm, we would not be able to bring politics to be worthy, if I want to say that, worthy of the economics that we have in the 21st century. Right? And so one sort of activist agenda is to have a political party law, just like we have a companies law. Right? And it should hold political parties to account in the same and maybe in more stringent way than we hold the companies to account. Right? I think that's an important area for us to look at more concretely and see how we can advocate for this particular cause. Let me stop here. Take any questions, comments, particularly on the last idea of the 21st century economy and the 18th century politics, right? And how they are in constant struggle.
Thank you so much, Parth. And could you explain us what you mean by liberal? I mean, like liberal has many, definitions. And today we actually seen that various kind of values has been actually added as a liberal, branded as a liberal ideas. Could you explain what you mean by liberal in your view?
I think, of course, as you said, there are many definitions of liberals or liberalism. And at one point in time, we used to describe them as sort of four pillars of sort of liberal philosophy, right? Individual rights, free trade, limited government, right? And rule of law. Right? So those four used to be the pillars of sort of liberal philosophy. I think as you work more and more in the space, and particularly I think what we are going through today around the globe, right? What you realize, the core foundation of that is the respect for the individuality, the dignity of the individual, right? Okay. I think all of those larger pillars, right, the foundation of it, that is the foundation of individual liberty and dignity, right? Okay. And a system that respects, that allows those to flourish, not just respect and tolerate it, but allows those liberties and dignities to flourish in different ways that individuals want to do, right, is a system that I will call a liberal system. Right? I think one core idea that combines, I think, of the liberalism and I think the politics of Gandhi, right, in some ways, is the principle of non-violence. In the Western libertarian philosophy, the principle they put at the foundation of the libertarian philosophy is the principle of non-aggression. You should not aggress at anyone, right, or against anyone. I think when you look at it from different angle, the principle that we talk about in India and in the Indian sort of culture and ethos is the principle of non-violence. So I think that, to me, is the most fundamental sort of foundation of what defines an individual, liberal, as well as liberal philosophy.
Okay. Thank you so much, Parth. And to follow up that one, you put non-violence as a centerpiece of liberalism. But if we see it, some of our audience in this session, and also some of the people who follow us, might have seen mainstream media that actually portraying different people as a liberal. people who's actually believing, largely central left people who's actually utilizing liberal label and actually doing violence, aggression, and lack of respect for a civilized debate. How do you see that one? Do you think we actually lost that label, or is that label doesn't matter? Values are the matters most.
No, I think values obviously are the ones that really matter. So there is no doubt about that. But labels obviously are important, right? This is how we form larger concepts and abstractions, and which is how we are able to engage with those larger ideas, right? So labels are, in a sense, representation of those ideas, and they do matter in any discourse, not just in intellectual discourse. And therefore, I think it's important to define those terms more precisely and consistently. But obviously, nobody has monopoly on the definition, right? So, as you can see in even the Oxford terms that we define all the time. So I think there has been this tension for a long time, right? So American meaning of liberal is very different than the European meaning of liberal. And for a long time in India, we used to refer to, when we say liberal, we always made a qualification, oh, we mean the European sense of liberal and not the American sense of liberal, right? In India, obviously, over a period of time, the more popular term now, and I think to some extent we have to give credit or blame to BJP for making this liberal term being redefined as people who are supportive of Congress, right? And therefore, sort of fudging this boundary between economic liberals and, say, political liberals, right? And therefore, I think in India, the term that we use at CCS have been using is market liberal, right? So yes, we are liberal in terms of individual rights, freedom of press, and all limitations on the government, right? So in that sense, we are liberal in the way it is. BJP uses that term, right? But also we are liberal in economic domain, right? Which is not currently, as you say, left liberals, the term that is being used, right? The left refers to their economic philosophy. The liberal refers to their political or personal philosophy, right, which enters in individual freedom. So I think for us, it is important to find a good way of capturing our ideas. So many of my friends, of course, use the word libertarian because that seems to be unpolluted as of today in Indian context. People understand what you are talking about when you say libertarian, since a liberal has now too many different connotations in the political discourse in India. The term that we have used, as I mentioned to earlier, is market liberal. So just putting an adjective before liberal to make sure that is individual and political freedom plus the economic freedom that goes with it.
Okay, you actually mentioned my next question was about the label that CCS is using it. So we as a liberals, classical liberals, when I say liberal in a sense, have a kind of rumor that says we actually favors the center-right parties or center-right people. We actually mingle with conservative ideas most of the time. Do you see classical liberalism has anything to do with conservative ideas? Where should we draw a line if there is a connection?
So when you mentioned the word classical liberal, this is also a term very commonly getting now, so more commonly used to differentiate our set of ideas. Of course, there's a new term coined by the opponents, which is the neoliberal, right? Which is a term of sort of ridicule in some sense. But I think now many other people, actually, as I see in the UK and other countries, have adopted that term to describe themselves, because now they realize that much of the literature has grown. We talk about neoliberalism, even though it is always in a very critical way. People find that that is the only way to relate to the current debate in the sort of political arena. Right? So yes, many are using the neoliberal as a sort of badge of honor to describe their own points of views. I think one interesting insight from Ayn Rand, right? Actually, my journey on this path began by reading her writings, as many of you know. I think her interesting insight was that the conservatives and liberals, right, give freedom in areas which they think are not so critical to their view of human flourishing or human purpose. So they give freedom in those areas to individuals, which is not so important for them. Areas they think are important for them are the areas in which they want government to control, right? Meaning they want to control themselves through the instrument of the government, of the state, right? So for conservatives, what matters a lot more, right, is your cultural and personal behavior, right? They are quite okay with whatever you do in the economic arena, right? Generally speaking, and therefore economics is much freer with the conservative thought, right? While the personal behavior is more tightly regulated, and there's a lot of emphasis on regulating that through the instrument of the state, right? For liberals, what matters more is sort of economic prosperity in some sense, right? They are for materialism, right? Quite, and of course, Marxism is materialism. And so what they don't consider not important is the personal behavior. So they are quite okay with giving freedom in that area. Right? People can do whatever they choose in their bedroom and consulting adults. Right? But they want to control very tightly what they think is the sort of heart of what human purpose is, which is material prosperity. And that's what they control through the instrument of state. I think Rand had a very interesting insight in terms of how each sort of political school of thought controls or is in favor of controlling what they think is important and giving freedom to individuals in areas that think is not important.
Thank you. Well said. So my next question goes. So yesterday I'm having a conversation with Syed Kamal, who was actually sort of an opposition leader in the European Parliament, former opposition leader, who's actually leading an ECR group, which is actually very strongly free market oriented, classical liberal leaning political party. So he was mentioning about the importance of the coalitions when we actually trying to strategize how we actually take our message to the people and also find our alliances. Do you think coalitions are very important for us to find partners from left and right? And if we actually go for the coalition, what kind of precautions we should take care in terms of losing our core message, our core ideas?
I think it's a very important question. I think it's also very relevant in today's very divided political discourse. And I think it's a challenge that I don't think we have a good solution for. So let me say this. The one thing is very clear, right? That you cannot be isolated. Right? We are living in network society, right? And networks, coalitions are going to be central to anything that succeeds in this society. Right? So we have to be part of a larger network, right? To engage with others, build those bridges, build those coalitions, right? I think challenge has been for us is to how to build those bridges and at the same time maintain our individuality. Right? And I think that I don't see that we have been able to find a good solution for it. Right? I'm sure there are many people who, of course, have thought about this, wrote about it. Right? My sort of personal take is that we liberals, libertarians, usually don't get as agitated, or at least not in a public sort of way. We may be agitated privately and maybe in our own smaller circles, right? We don't have as much moral outrage, let me put it that way, against things which are wrong, that we think are wrong by our own philosophy. Right? Unlike the other sides, both on the left as well as on the right, right? The moral outrage that you see is against abortion, for example, right? Is very palpable. The outrage against what the left defines as exploitation of the worker, right, is a very palpable thing. Right? While if you think about it, the issues that matter to us, you would not be able to find that kind of moral outrage in any particular setting, right, at a larger scale, right, let alone at a global scale. I think one, in a sense, the level of tolerance, and which is of course virtue in our philosophy, right, live and let live. Part of that is that we are also willing to let others live the way they choose to live or ideas they want to hold. Right? And my sense is that unless we have ways of bringing people together on something that generates that collective moral outrage, right? you can't put your identity clearly in public domain, right? And if you don't have that identity, what are you outraged about fundamentally and clearly sort of understood by the public at large, right? This is what defines you in a sense, at least one of the important ways, right? It's hard to sort of maintain that individuality and build coalitions, right? So when the left goes out to build coalition with anyone, people don't confuse them, right? They know what they stand for, right? The economic controls, right? They are, or you put it in a different way, for the workers' right versus for labor versus capital, however you want to phrase that sort of idea. They also know what the other right stands for, nationalism and religion, all of that, right? They don't really know. We are somewhere in the middle, and we don't have those issues of outrage that people can associate with, right? And I think until we build that, I don't know, community, build that sort of fiber, I don't think it's hard to maintain that identity in public domain, right? And therefore, we are always, like, you know, at CCS, we also try to work with the left groups, right? Because they are for street vendors. Right? They champion the cause of the poor. And so do we, right? Liberals also champion the cause of the poor, right? So with a natural alliance in that area, we can work with otherwise left-leaning groups because they're also working the same domain. But for them, it seems very consistent in terms of what they do. For us, for many people outside, it seems very inconsistent. Right? Oh, why would you worry about a street vendor? You're supposed to be championing the cause of the capital. That's the image they have, right? And therefore, it's incongruent for them, hard to understand. Why would a liberal organization would be spending so much time and energy talking about street vendors and what rights they have and what should be the legal structure to allow them to operate freely right, in Indian cities and towns. So I think I do feel that unless we have the moral outrage of the kind the left and right are able to show, right? And you can see, I mean, what's happening today in the US is a classic example, right? People at New York Times, the opinion page editor gets fired, right, for running an op-ed piece, right? I mean, that's the level of outrage they're able to generate, right? We are not.
True. So one other thing you might have known, I actually associated with Loksatta for a long time. I was a student leader, youth leader, and also I was involved with the anti-corruption movement. Then when I actually slightly changed, when I actually moved towards more liberal activists, I mean, trying to promote liberal ideas, and people actually see I actually running away from the real problems of the people. This is the one other thing some people accuse me of. You become an elite. I mean, you actually join an elitist movement, but that's not the case. CCS and many other organizations are actually proving that we actually championing the poor. Could you explain a couple of more examples how CCS is able to help poor in terms of street vending and also education through the vouchers and also property rights? Could you tell brief stories how you were able to help the poor people and why liberalism?
Well, let me sort of cite one thing that we learned in working with the street vendors. Right? So there are many NGOs, as you know, and many organizations that work to support street vendors, right? Either in terms of access to credit, right? They can borrow money cheaply, or helping them to buy so various things they need, right? Capital goods they need. So there are many people who are trying to help them in many of these areas, right? The question that we kept asking, that despite all the support that is coming from civil society, non-profit sector, and of course there's a lot of support, not of the right kind, but from the also state, right? Why aren't they able to progress and get a better life for themselves? So I remember seeing this woman in the local market, right? So we're sitting there with a small basket of flowers. Right? And year after year, for almost now, I think maybe more than 15 years, she has been there selling the same thing, of the same size basket. Right? It's a very simple thing that if you can't expand your business, you just can't earn higher revenue, right? And there's no higher profit. As the cost goes up, actually your revenues, profits are going to decline in many cases. Right? And so you ask yourself, why is this woman stuck with this same size basket? Right? And many people, of course, assume that, of course, she is not capable of doing bigger business. It doesn't have the skills required to grow and maybe diversify, right? And therefore, of course, this one thing is used to, keeps doing it after year after year. When you begin to engage with them, you realize that, yes, no, there are entrepreneurs. Yes, not all of them are, but many of them are. Right? They have the skills, they have the stamina, they have this sort of capacity to think and execute things, organize themselves. Right? But even then, they are not able to grow. Right? And that was sort of a puzzling question when you started working in this space. Right? And I think what we came to, and I think that was our main insight, and therefore the work that is done by CCS is built on that key insight. Right? That as long as the person remains informed, there's no legal status, even a temporary legal status, the person cannot diversify or expand. Right? To give you a very concrete example, I'm sure many of you have seen this police van and the raid in many of the urban markets. Right? I have seen many times with my own eyes. A van would come with the police and local MCD officers, right? And as soon as people see the van, sometimes the call comes before the van comes. All the vendors grab their stuff and then run. Some of them hide in the nearby shop because they have made a deal with the shopkeepers. When this happens, we're going to throw our goods in your shop and hide ourselves until the clearance operation gets done. That is what they call it, the clearance operation. Right? And so when you see that, you realize that even after paying the hafta, that they do pay. Right? Everybody pays the hafta to occupy the space they're occupying. Right? You see that even after paying the hafta, they are not legal. The next police van comes, they have to grab their things and run. Right? And therefore, what it means, and this is actually the key insight, that under that system, the size of your business will be as big as the reach of your arms. Right? Because if you expand business beyond that, the next police van comes, you can't grab your goods and run. You will lose them. Right? And just this single state of informality, right, has condemned the millions of people in India to life of subsistence. Right? Despite all the skills they can muster, right? All the enterprise they can muster, they just cannot. Because I would not be able to expand my business beyond the reach of my arms. Right? I think that is really at the heart of what's, I think, troubling millions of people. And of course, you saw what happened during the pandemic. Right? I think that is what we have been working on, how to provide that legal safety, even temporary. Doesn't mean that they have to be given the space forever, right? But temporary legal safety. And we have done a couple of pilot programs to show the ones who provide them even the 1 year space. No raid would happen for 1 year in this market. You see the market's just booming. People's incomes rising multiple times.
That is true. That is true. 2014 Act was actually helps a lot for many street vendors, and my family itself was actually my mother was a street vendor actually until my brother and I actually found a job. This act I can actually easily relate to how much importance for the people whose actually livelihood is depending on their day-to-day work. And thank you so much for that great work. And my last question is actually, you actually try to connect economics with politics and importance of political way to actually achieve liberal principles. So could you tell, one question I have, is it necessary to have a classical liberal political party to actually win like a liberal change, or should we actually enter or infiltrate into the ranks of the different political parties, like social democrats, are like kind of Congress, who's actually left-leaning, and also conservative party BJP. We rise the ranks of those parties and actually try to push changes toward more liberal ideology.
I think to build on my answer to your previous question about the coalition, right? Now, at the same time, how do we maintain our identity? So part of my answer was that we are not able to show moral outrage. There are no set of issues that people associate with liberal sort of school of thought, where there's a public moral outrage of the kind that you see on the other sides, right? I think that is also part of the reason why we don't have a political party. Right? A political party has to rely on emotions. It's not an intellectual exercise, right? and we are not able to generate those emotions for the issues that we care about by articulating them and presenting them in the way that it would generate those emotions in the public, right? And I think many people have written, I think the book that I referred to earlier, A Fesrif for Mr. S.C. Raju, is a chapter in the book by Jaitit Rao, who also has a book now on the conservative Indian conservative, right? And he writes in the book about the impossibility of a liberal political party. And his argument is that nowhere in the world a liberal political party standing on both economic freedom as well as personal freedom with equal sort of emphasis has been able to rise to power. Right? And wherever the economic liberals have come to power or have played that kind of dominant role in the governance is always with some other group, and usually has been the conservative parties of the countries in those countries, right? So we look at the Western European countries, that is true. Of course, US is very much true, right? And therefore, his argument is that we are condemned to find people who are sympathizers of our ideas across all parties. We are unlikely to have our own political party. So I hope some of your listeners take up that challenge and prove him wrong.
I hope so. Do you, I just wanted to extend one more question and follow up to that one. Can we actually trade off social freedom with economic freedom, or political freedom with economic?
Can we actually?
Can we trade off social and political freedom with economic freedom? If we see the China actually doesn't have political social freedom, but at least they would be able to actually feed themselves. And therefore, economic freedom actually able to at least give life for them. Do you think we can actually trade off in countries like us?
I think that gives you answer about the Ayn Rand's insight between conservatives and liberals, right? Who want to control what through the machinery of the state, right? I think that insight also explains this, right? That if you believe the economic life is the most important part of human life, then obviously you are willing to sacrifice your political freedom, personal freedoms, and say, as long as I can put bread on the table and don't go to sleep hungry at night, then it's okay, right? And there's, of course, one school of thought that does support that line. Right? Of course, there are other schools of thought which are the other way around. Doesn't matter whether you are economically successful or not. What matters is that, what is your, right? And that's also that school of thought, right? For us, both things matter. For liberals, we see human life and human flourishing not only as an economic sort of prosperity, but also as moral flourishing. Right? For us, economics and morality or ethics both matter equally, right? And therefore, I think it's a difficult balance, right? And which is why I think your question about liberal political party, which can emphasize why both are important, right? It's not that we have to chase blindly the economic dream and sacrifice everything in the process, right? Or other way around, that sacrifice economic life and then chase other sort of moral life in a way, as people see it today. Right? We need both because we are human beings with our body and soul, and we need to nourish both our body as well as the soul. Right? And that I think is a difficult argument so far for us to that we have not been able to make very I think effectively.
Yeah, thank you so much, Parth, for actually a very insightful session on liberalism in India. Before we actually sign off, like most of our audience are liberty curious, who is interested in public policy, and also some of them actually politically very enthusiastic. I would like to ask what kind of opportunities Center for Civil Society and also Indian School of Public Policy you guys recently actually started can provide for them? What kind of learning and also training opportunities your institutes actually provide?
I think Indian School of Public Policy maybe is much more relevant in terms of how to engage in public policy space, right? And I think that there are a lot of young people, obviously, are very excited about using public policy tools as a way to engage in this larger debate around the role of the state, right? There are also dangers to it. So there are many friends of mine who point out that it's not always going to go in the direction we want it to go, right? And of course, that's certainly the case, right? You can't deny that. But of course, having more and more people who are trained and are adapt in thinking, at least being able to weigh the pros and cons, right? Even though they may not be fully committed to our ideas, at least they are exposed to those ideas, exposed to those options and choices, right? Could actually bring about a better debate, at least, right, in the country in terms of what we should be doing in public policy space, right? So the ISPP is trying to serve that function of creating that informed engagement with public policy. And then the CCS, as you know, has been doing a lot of work in the field that you talked about, livelihoods, education, governance, right? So those of the people in your audience who are willing to work in those domains, right, are most welcome to sort of take up projects there, right? We do internships also at CCS. The CCS Academy that takes these ideas, our market liberal ideas, to larger audience in India, right? Particularly the young audience in India. So that's also great work, right? If you're politically inclined, there's no political party to go to, but at least you can be part of the CCS Academy and find ways to take these ideas to larger audiences, right? And it doesn't have to be a seminar always, right? It could be different ways of taking these ideas to audiences, right? And each one of us with a different gift, right? I may be good in one way of communicating it. You'll be good in different way of communicating it, right? And therefore it's important that people with different skills, different aspirations, different sort of paths, push these ideas in their own ways wherever they are.
Thank you so much, Parth, and we really had a great session. And we at Swatantrata always love to work with organizations like Center for Civil Society at advancing our common beliefs. And thank you so much for joining this point of time.
My
where
pleasure.
the time is very
all the best to the young organization. I look forward to your flourishing, both body and soul. So that'll be great to see.
Thank you so much, Parth. Have a good day. Thank you so much.